ausgemacht. So thank you to all of you who braved our situation to come today. This is in some ways the beginning of the end of the course, today's lecture, and a culmination of what we've been talking about all along. I want to remind you of the larger story, the story of modernity, the story of development, the story of democracy, the big themes we've been tracing since 1700, and especially since 1848. And in my last lecture to you, I introduced you to our third and final major myth of the course, the myth of global solidarity or international solidarity. And we talked a little bit about how in the aftermath of the Second World War, in the aftermath of the trauma of the rise and triumph of Hitler in Europe and the triumph of Stalin in the Soviet Union, both Europe and the Soviet Union tried, in some sense, to reinvent themselves or to remake themselves. We talked a little bit about how the European Union was a kind of a utopian, in some sense, project born of the ideas of the Count Coudenhove-Kalergi for a unified global mission for Europe, to overcome the mistakes of the past while at the same time realizing what was good, or what was, you could say, desirable in those aspirations, to move forward without losing track of the promises of modernity, the promises of democracy, the promises of development, and the notion that those two things could be integrated, and that a revolutionary vision of the world, a vision of the world based on enduring and constant change, could in fact create a society, a globe that was brought the greatest good to the greatest number. Today's lecture moves to the realm of language and the question of language and power. And I wanted to begin this lecture with this brief clip and you could say a montage from Alexander Sokurov's film version of Goethe's Faust, which was released in 2011. As the producer, Andrei Ziegler, claimed, the film is a big Russian cultural project, and for Putin it's very important, a film that can introduce the Russian mentality into European culture, to promote integration between Russian and European culture. With this lecture and with this theme of language and power, we're returning to our origins, in some sense, back to Goethe's Faust, to the original myth, the development, the myth of the promise of transformation with which we began. And it's significant and interesting, I think, that 2011, or as recently as 2011, a film version of Goethe's Faust, the great story of Europe, was produced in Russia with the desire to find a kind of common ground and a common language between these Russia and Europe. The key tension, or the basic opposition of today's lecture, is the tension between the sacred and the profane. In many ways, you could say the promise of modernity is a promise of secularization. It's a promise of taking us away from God towards a world that's based more on reason and rationality and the rule and democracy, insofar as it's about the authority of all the people in society, not the authority of some far off and distant God who can tell us what we have to do. We've been moving towards that, you can say, throughout the course and throughout the thinkers we've been looking at. And we face a crisis, you could say, of this promise, especially in the year 1968. So if I were to encapsulate for you in one word what today's lecture is all about, it's the crisis of modernity itself. That's why it matters to our story, and that's why we have to pay attention to the year 1968 and to all those debates about language and power that erupted in that time. 1968, you could say, we come full circle back to the original promises of 1848. Of the springtime of the peoples. And the uprising in Paris in that same year is also about looking back and trying to reclaim and trying to remember what the original promise of modernity was all about. But modernity is in crisis. The legacies of Hitler, the legacies of Stalin cannot be forgotten so easily. It seems that if the promises of 1848 were the promises that led to the rise of these kind of dictators and the domination of the many by the few, perhaps there's something fundamentally wrong with the very notion of modernity, with the very notion of modernism that was supposed to take us there. So we confront, you could say, a choice a choice that asks, do we want to turn back? In many ways, the crisis of 1968 and the crisis of modernity is a crisis that looks in two directions. Back towards anti-modern orthodoxy. And in some ways, and for some people, both in Europe and Russia, that is the choice. The problem with modernity was its failure to take sufficiently seriously what God and the idea of a religious worldview had promised. It had thrown the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. That the promises of transformation had led to the abandonment of what was best and most valuable in humanity. But there was also a moment for doubling down, you could say, on the promises of modernity. And the turn towards postmodernism, which we see in a lot of the linguistic thought and philosophy of the day, is in many ways an attempt to go even further with the questions and with the solutions, you see, provided by the modernist view of the world. Questioning not only the authority of God, questioning the authority of the individual person and of the author himself as a sort of source of legitimacy and a source of power. So I have on this slide two quotations juxtaposed to symbolize perhaps or to try to bring together the notions of the sacred and the profane. Nietzsche's declaration at the end of the 19th century that God is dead, but also the reminder that God was, from the very beginning, associated very deeply with the idea of language. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Indeed, Goethe's Faust is a text which takes this idea and plays with it. If you read Marshall Berman's take on Goethe carefully, you might notice that he talks about Faust's own struggle. We see maybe the word struggle for the first time in the course, with Faust trying to translate this passage from John, from the very beginning of the Bible, into German, translating from Greek. He confronts the word logos, the word that means maybe rationality and reason, and he doesn't know what word he should find for it. We see dramatize the problem of translation. Is the best translation of logos into German Wort? Is it Sinn? Is it Kraft or power? Is it Tat or deed? He doesn't know. My very first lecture, I suggested to you that Europe and Russia are born in translation. And this is part of what I meant. And this is maybe the lecture in which we make good on that premise. So we look at how that problem of translation and how the problem of language comes back to haunt Europe and Russia in the 20th century on the cusp, you could say, of our own day. You'll notice the word author is embedded in the word authoritative. And in talking about language and power in the 20th century, in the latter half of the 20th century, we're also asking about who has the right to speak and whose speech should we take seriously when we think about the kind of world we want to make and the world we want to build. Who is the author of our existence? Are we the author of our own existence? To be the author of your own existence, of course, is to be the subject and the object of your own development. Or is the author of our existence God? God who in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And how can we distinguish between false powers or authorities, those who claim to speak for the good of humanity and the good of the whole, and those who actually do? In the late 20th century, especially in, you could say, the socialist countries of the Warsaw Pact, the idea of the dissident is born, or in some sense reborn. People who questioned the regimes and the power and the rights of their regimes to tell them who they were and what they ought to do. But I use this idea even more widely to suggest this larger crisis of modernity. At the end of the 20th century, all authoritative sources of power had been called into question in some sense. And the preoccupation with language, the preoccupation with literature, and with the relationship between language and power, I would argue to you, was born of that crisis. So in a very short and brief sense, what I've just talked to you about right now is the sum total of what I want to talk to you about today in sort of greater detail and with more examples. Now, the crisis of authority in Eastern Europe, and especially you could say in the Soviet Union, begins earlier, I would say, than it begins in the West, earlier than it begins in Europe. Because in many ways, with the death of Stalin, the question of authoritative discourse comes in a major way to the Soviet Union. And in fact, the term authoritative discourse itself is one I take from a Russian literary philosopher and theorist, Bakhtin. You might remember this figure from earlier in the course, Nikolai Marr. He was the great theorist of language in the Soviet Union. Marrism was the dominant theory of how language works and how meaning works from the 1920s to the to the year 1950. And Marr's theory, just to remind you, was the idea that if Marx is right and the economic base in our lives, that is the economic relationships, determine the cultural and political superstructure, then it should follow, logically, that language is also based on an economic base superstructure relationship. In other words, that when you change your society from a bourgeois society into a communist society, the language will change. In the future, people will no longer be speaking bourgeois, national, or feudal languages. They'll be speaking the language of communism. Essentially, this is a powerful claim for the class nature of language. Language is about class rather than nation. But in the summer of 1950, this was creating all kinds of problems in the Soviet Union. People wanted to know how far they should go in accepting the Marxist interpretation. And so Stalin himself intervened in the debate about language. This is a great example of how authoritative discourse works. Somewhere in 1950, Stalin provides an answer to a question in Pravda about whether Marx's theory of language is correct. The question is it true that language is a superstructure on the base? Stalin answers, no, it is not true. That is the authoritative discourse. He tells all linguists, all philosophers, everybody what they should think about language. And essentially, he initiates, you could say in some ways, the revolution in language in the Soviet Union by actually calling the main and dominant theory of language prevailing over the course of the previous 30 years not only into question, but declaring it false. Second question, is it true that language always was and is class language? That there's no such thing as a language which was the common language of a society, a non-class language common to the whole people? Once again, Stalin intervenes. Stalin's answer, no, it is not true. In other words, language does not belong to classes. Language belongs to nations. Language belongs to an entire society. Now, I'm using this example for two reasons. I'm trying to kill two birds with one stone, you could say here. One is to show how the debate about language unfolds in the second half of the 20th century in the Soviet Union. And second, and more importantly, to give you an example of authoritative discourse. Up until this point, or through this point, you could say, Stalin is the one who provides the authoritative discourse of the Soviet Union. Whatever he says is true. And the Soviet Union and the Communist Party knows how to react and how to deal with that situation. But when Stalin dies in 1953, he leaves open the question of where the authoritative discourse is going to come from. Who is going to say what is true and who is going to say what is false? It's a problem. You could say the crisis of modernity in the Soviet Union, in some sense, it really becomes apparent after Stalin's death already in 1953. We read, for our last discussion, Khrushchev's secret speech. In many ways, you could say Khrushchev's secret speech is a symbolic end of authoritative discourse in the Soviet Union. He's trying to claim authority, but he's not really successful in doing so. His declaration about the past history of the Soviet Union provokes a myriad of debates inside the Soviet Union and around the world about who is right, who speaks the truth, who speaks in the interests of the people. All those problems of modernity, about development and democracy and getting on board become doubly problematic, you could say, following the death of Stalin in the atmosphere of the secret speech and the thaw in the Soviet Union. Now, He used the shattered slide sort of to just drive home the point of the shattered sense of a whole. And if you remember that the big theme for this third part of the course, the big third myth, is global solidarity. The shattering of authoritative discourse also shows the extent to which that global solidarity is a failed project, is not possible. That global solidarity is not possible because there are so many different voices speaking so many different things, arguing for their own right to claim the truth, losing track of that common sense of right and wrong and true and false. Now, there's one figure in the Russian intellectual world who becomes enormously important in this environment. Mikhail Bakhtin lived a long and productive life. He was born in 1895, and his earliest years took him through some of the great and most, you could say, multicultural cities of the Russian Empire. He lived in Vilnius, the capital of present-day Lithuania. He lived in Odessa, and he even attended Odessa University, another multicultural place right on the in Ukraine. And he lived in Petrograd, the capital of the Russian Empire, and briefly, you could say, the capital of the Russian Revolution before Moscow acquired that status. These were places of remarkable multicultural, you could say, diversity. And in the 1920s, he became an important philosopher, thinker in his own right. As a member of the Bakhtin Circle, he gathered around him other important thinkers and writers. Between 1924 and 1927, they asked really interesting questions about language and meaning, about authority. But they weren't, you could say, very important on the largest, you say, political and social scale. They weren't known across the entire Soviet Union. In 1928, Bakhtin was arrested, sent to a labor camp and into exile in Kazakhstan. And you could say he was, like most people, kind of traumatized by the experience, and spent most of the rest of his life teaching at a pedagogical institute in Saransk, sort of surrounded by the Finno-Ugric population there, basically forgotten by the Soviet Union or to the Soviet Union. He was rediscovered only in 1963, and a lot of people were very surprised that it turned out that Bakhtin was not dead, but still alive. He was discovered and rediscovered and brought back to Moscow, where he became something of a Soviet celebrity, but more than a Soviet celebrity, a world celebrity. And he was perhaps the most, you could say, or one of the most important, really and most controversial thinkers of the last half of the 20th century anywhere in the world. He inspired a lot of people in Europe as well. Now, what was the content of Bakhtin's thought? Bakhtin was important, I think, precisely in this moment of his rediscovery, because he took on, or his work dealt with this problem of authoritative discourse and dissident discourse. He asked about the nature of a good society and how the voices in it should come together to create the kind of whole we want. He seemed to be just the thinker and just the voice people wanted for saving modernity from itself. Maybe this is one reason why the French were so enamored of Bakhtin, why they translated all his works, and why he became enormously powerful and important in America as well. This opposition, we'll get to it in a second, authoritative versus dialogic discourse, is really what I want to take away from Bakhtin for the purposes of our class. But you could say his contribution was really multifaceted. And in many ways, you could say his work speaks to all the great problems we've talked about in this course, to all the problems of modernity. He had three authors that he was particularly interested in studying. The first was the French writer Rabelais. And from Rabelais, he investigated, was really interested in this 16th century French thinker who was really contributed in many ways to the making of the modern French language, to his notions of and use of, in his kind of epic kind of literature, of the carnival and the grotesque, of the way in which peasant life and peasant ideas intruded into or made their way into upper class French life, how they became important and significant. His other major author, an area of concern about which we know the least because most of his works were destroyed in the bombings of the Second World War, but was on Goethe himself, taking on the question of the Bildung, the development of the individual, and with Goethe's interpretations of Faust. And the third major author, you could say, at the center of his work, and the most important one by far, was Dostoyevsky, the great Russian writer himself. Now, when Bakhtin was rediscovered and brought back to Moscow by his, you could say, he became the center of a kind of debate, and a debate that really unfolded between the West, between Western Europe and Russia, about what was his meaning, what was his legacy. Russians loved his love of Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky was in many ways a legacy, you could say, or he participated in the legacy of the Slavophiles. He was the great Russian national writer in some ways who had taken on Kirevsky's challenge to look for Russian identity in things that were uniquely Russian. He was also an Orthodox thinker, and Bakhtin had also was Orthodox in his own way. So in many ways, Bakhtin came to be associated, for some people, with religiosity, with orthodoxy, and with Dostoevsky as a Slavophile thinker. But at the same time, he became associated with another side of Dostoevsky, and this is the one that was perhaps more emphasized in the West. Dostoevsky as a writer who gives the most powerful voice to the people he disagrees with most. Dostoevsky as the writer who makes powerful the voices of the opposition. Dostoevsky, as Marshall Berman invoked him for us, not as a conservative thinker, but as the thinker who lays the groundwork for the revolution, who talks about the man in the street, who talks about the underground man, who will rise up and question the powers and authorities above him. So along the way, we can say in his work on Rabelais, his preoccupation with the modern problem of revolution. How do revolutions happen? How do the little people ultimately rise up against those who oppress them? In his work on Goethe, you could say, he takes on the modern problem of development. How do we create the new man, the new society, the new person? What kind of new person do we want, or how should it emerge? And in writing on Dostoevsky, you could say, he takes on the fundamental modern problem of democracy. What does it mean for the people to actually rule themselves? How do we make all the voices in society work together to envision and to imagine and to create a world that is better? Now, there's some terms, and we'll get into these in our discussion on Friday, so I don't want to say much, but you'll notice his vocabulary is full of big words like heteroglossia, polyphony, and the main thing to notice about these is how they're all about the existence of many voices in a single language, a text, or a musical work. Bakhtin is perhaps the first and most important person in the second half of the 20th century to make people notice how texts are put together out of many different elements, how societies are also comprised of a multiplicity of voices, and that this, in some sense, is the key to what is good, what is powerful, what is meaningful. I've asked you to read, and for last week you did, and we'll talk about this on Friday, his brief essay on the epic and the novel. And for the purposes of this lecture, I just want to emphasize this distinction between what the epic and what does and what the novel does, these two genres of literature. The older genre of the epic, as he evokes it, is a great example of authoritative discourse, a kind of language that does not, say, make room for its own criticism, for its own questioning. The Bible, for example. Bible, of course, there's been a lot of biblical criticism and biblical questioning, but the Bible is an authoritative text. It is the truth, and it is supposed to be the truth for those who believe it. It's precisely the opposite with the novel. The novel, he says, consists of many different voices, all speaking at the same time at one another. The novel is a new genre, unlike the epic. It's something that is born with modernity. It's something that came into being, really, the first novel, maybe Cervantes' Don Quixote, around the same time of the Renaissance, and the notion of the reawakening of classical culture. And it really only came into its own after the French Revolution. The novel was born and developed with modernity. And it reminds us also of this modern predicament of living in a world with many different voices and trying to figure out what those voices have to say to each other and how they might speak to truth, in some larger sense. So dialogic discourse is what Bakhtin opposes to the idea of authoritative discourse. Dialogic discourse, perhaps, is what will save modernity from itself. If we can create a society in which we'll have many different voices, and all those voices will be given a chance to speak, and we can, through our conversations and through our interactions with one another, somehow cultivate a world where those voices can combine to create the ideal that we want, where the authoritative discourse is no longer something that is imposed from above, but a dialogic discourse that wells up from below, where the voices of the many matter more than the voices of the few. In all these ways, you could say Bakhtin was enormously inspiring and optimistic, and was just what you could say the crisis of modernity required and wanted. It's really after 1968 that we see a Bakhtin boom throughout the Western world. His works are published all over the place. And I want to just leave this slide, and this sort of very lengthy introduction, with one I think his most relevant statements. And it's often said that if we were to reduce Bakhtin to a single claim, it's this one that I've bold-faced in the quotation. In point of fact, the word, it should be the word, is a two-sided act. It is determined equally by those whose word it is and for whom it is meant. Each and every word expresses the one in relation to the other. It's a very simple idea in some sense, but it sounded new in the 1960s and 70s. The word is a two-sided act. The word doesn't belong to the people who impose authority on you. It doesn't also belong merely to those who are questioning authority. It belongs to both. And if we can understand words and language this way, we can find that common language, that common way of seeing the world, which will actually benefit all of humanity, through which we can save modernity and the idea of an integrated development and democracy. One way he had of opposing the epic and the novel as materials was, he said, the epic is made of marble, the novel is made of clay. That the point being here again that the epic, with its authoritative discourse, is set in stone. It's something that can't be changed. It's something that's rigid. But the ideal world, the modern world we want, is a world of many voices, the world that's malleable, changeable. Maybe not a world where everything that is solid melts into air, but at least a world where we can change their forms. So that was a very lengthy, you could say, introduction, but a very substantial one too. That is the extent of what I want to sort of talk to you, say to you about really Bakhtin and about the idea of authoritative discourse as it was mattered in the Soviet Union and as it came into crisis. I want to pan out now a little bit for this part of the lecture to a wider perspective, you could say, on the crisis of modernity, and a crisis that really erupts or becomes visible everywhere in 1968. 1968 was declared by the United Nations human rights year. It was a very optimistic and you could say idealistic year in that sense. The hope was that 1968 would be the year when the promises, you could say, of modernity would finally realize themselves, and that we would deal with the problems of the Second World War, the problems that we talked about last time, of how states can be cruel and violate the rights and the lives of their citizens. And the hope was that somehow this, again, you can say, is an expression of the myth of global solidarity, human rights here, the idea that the whole world is going to come together and that it's somehow this European ideal of human rights is going to become the basis for organizing the globe. But it was actually, in many ways, you could say, a year that was remarkable precisely for its failure to be this. In some ways, it reminds us, again, of 1848 again and the revolution then. The hope was that 1848 would be the moment when democracy and development finally emerged in integrated form, and it was not. 68, basically the same thing. 1968, you could say, was a year of alienation, and it spoke to the urban alienation that had grown up, you could say, over the course of the post-war era. Something I left out of an earlier lecture because I was sick or was remained home because it was, but was the idea that the period after the Second World War, like modernity itself, is a period of great urbanization. More and more people move to cities. After the Second World War, Europe becomes a predominantly urban society. And over the course of urbanization, we see the building of Khrushchevkas in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet lands, but not much better public housing in the West. If you compare French public housing with Soviet public housing, it's often hard to tell the difference, if I were to show you two pictures. These new apartment buildings, you could say, became sources of alienation. People living in their little boxes, not talking ever to their neighbors. The whole notion of global solidarity on a most microcosmic level was supposed to be about integrating humanity. But if you don't even talk to your neighbors, how can you speak to the world? And this perception or sense that societies were not really coming back together. Remember, World War II had fractured societies. Turned more people into nomads than ever before or since. People were thrown out of their homes. They moved back and discovered the people who had betrayed them or the people who had collaborated against them. There was a profound lack of trust we talked about last time too in societies. And this alienation, you could say, was one of its outcomes or symptoms. At the same time, you could say it was a moment in which it was hoped for, or a greater humanism was desired and hoped for. Now, as examples of the way in which this global solidarity fails or doesn't work are all the uprisings that occur in this period. And I just want to mention a few of them. You might note them down, look them up later. In the East, we have workers sort of uprising in 1953 already, in the year of the death of Stalin, hoping to kind of claim a different vision of their society. In Budapest in 1956, we see the outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution. This is in the year, of course, of the secret speech, and in reaction to the secret speech, when we see, again, a failure of global solidarity, and the extent to which the promises of Soviet Union, modern promises of Soviet Union, are revealed as failed promises, when the Hungarian Communist Party really turns against Moscow. Most importantly, and this is what I'm going to focus on, we have Paris and Prague. A reminder, and I put Paris in white rather than in sort of this light yellow, to remind us that these demonstrations and protests are not merely behind the Iron Curtain in Europe as well. And this is sort of a profound example of this. Later on, we see it in West Berlin in the 1970s, these kind of violence in the street. But what do all of these uprisings or moments of social unrest have in common? And they speak to the failure, you could say, of the promise of global solidarity. They speak to the failure of authoritative discourse, of those who are in power to legitimate themselves in a way that the people who are below them believe that they have their best interests and the best interests of society in heart. They are examples of modernity in crisis. Now, in 1968, the two figures who become kind of figureheads of their respective revolutions, are students. And 1968 is a useful and a convenient year to think about, because even more, 1948, it's an uprising of students, or begins as such. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, or Danny Le Rouge, is in some ways the leader of the students protesting in Paris. Jan Palach becomes a martyr to the idea of Czech freedom when he burns himself alive on Wenceslas Square in January of 1969. And one thing we can notice through the youth of these two young men and through the youth of the uprisings happening here is the extent to which this new generation coming of age around the age of 20 or 21 does not want to accept the truth and the authority of their parents. In some ways, it's a generational conflict. It's the generation of people who were born around the time of the Second World War or right after it, asking about whether they want the same things that their parents wanted, whether their parents' choices about the world were worth pursuing. They're both, in some sense, a combination of a student and a worker revolution. There are plenty of workers in the street as well as students. And they both, in some sense, express a kind of a desire for an anti-consumerist democracy. I mean, that's one thing they have in common, is that they are, and we'll talk about consumerism in a bit, as one of the great problems of the 1960s, 70s, or as a feature, you could say, of society, that idealistic students in particular, and to some extent workers too, are questioning through their protests. At the same time, the slogans of these uprisings are very, initially at least, very optimistic. In Paris, all power to the imagination. In Prague, socialism with a human face. And of course, the failure of these uprisings, again in Paris and Prague, leads to all that much greater disappointment. It's the last stand, you can say, in some sense, in the period we're looking at, or in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, for a kind of, for modernism and modernity, for the notion that somehow the visions that we've lived with all along we could turn them into something good. That perhaps Stalin's version of socialism didn't work, but we can have socialism with a human face. We don't have to give up on socialism. All power to the imagination. Maybe our capitalistic French society is not perfect as it is, but somehow, by emphasizing our imagination and our power to think a new world order, we can overcome the limitations of the society that we're currently in. We don't have to reject everything. Paris and Prague, 1968, are a symptom also, as I pointed out last time, of Americanization and Sovietization. In some sense, you could say what the students were protesting in Paris that had to do specifically with internal French predicament and problems, but with the lack of popularity, you could say that President de Gaulle faced. But it was also about opposing consumerist culture and university reforms, which seemed to be associated with the idea of the Americanization of France, with American power, of course, and that had transformed and changed French culture in powerful ways. It was the largest general strike in French history. 11 million workers and students, 22% of the entire population, went on strike for two weeks. So when we're looking for evidence of mass discontent, there's no moment in the history of France, maybe the world, that's better than sort of this protest in Paris in 1968. But like 1848, it ends much the same. De Gaulle is restored to power. Conservative authorities are reinforced. The rich, you could say, or the bourgeoisie rather, become scared of radical students. And so they double down on supporting the authorities that they've always had. Meanwhile, at the same time in Prague, one of the most fascinating things about, you could say, the Prague Spring is that it's actually an uprising that comes from within the Communist Party. It shows that even the Communist Party can't agree internationally on the kind of vision it wants. And the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, pictured here on the cover of Time magazine, is trying to reform the system from within. He is the one who comes up with the slogan, socialism with a human face. And so many intellectuals and so many common people, you could say, believe in this idea and hope for this. The response from the Soviet Union is to send thousands of tanks to suppress the demonstrations, and this results in what comes to be known in the Cold War as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Here we see a much too close embrace between Leonid Brezhnev and Dubček, and the Brezhnev Doctrine as the policy or the understanding in the Warsaw Pact that whenever there are uprisings, discontent among the nations and nation states of Eastern Europe, that the Soviet Union can and will intervene with force. So you can see authority comes from a tank at this point. It doesn't come from a sense of common ideology, a sense of common understanding. In many ways, Paris and Prague are the best symbols, representatives of this crisis of modernity, in that we have the majority or a large portion of each population doesn't like the kind of world they're living in, doesn't want what's been made for them. And yet they're told that this has been the culmination of almost 200 years of development and democracy and revolution. An interesting place to see how this sort of explodes on the most intimate level is to notice how even within a nation, within the Czech nation, nobody can agree. The question, is protest worthwhile? Can we change the world by protesting? Is the debate of 1968-69 taken on by the children of the Prague Spring and Alexander Dubček's Socialism Within Human Face? Both of these figures have a bourgeois background, and they're perhaps the two most famous Czechs in the Western world today. Future Czech president Václav Havel, author of The Power of the Powerless, and you could say the maker of the dissident movement, the United Dissident Movement of Eastern Europe, leader of the Velvet Revolution in 1989, Czech president from 1993 to 2003, with a political philosophy of humanitarianism, environmentalism, anti-consumerism, important to, and a civil activist. And Milan Kundera, who runs away, of course, to Paris and to France, and becomes perhaps the other, and maybe even more famous Czech of our era, writes these wonderful books, The Joke, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and muses over the lot of small nations. But the question over which their debate unfolds in 68 and 69 is really this question, is it worthwhile to protest the regime we're in? Does it make sense to rise up against the tanks that come against us? Can we change this world? And Havel's answer is really yes. And Kundera's answer, you could say, is no. But it's significant that two of the most, I think, important intellectual figures within this small nation fundamentally disagree. Again, we don't have a common point of view on what we can accomplish with our democracy and development and revolution. The disappointment, you could say, with modernity echoes in the very fact of this debate about the Czech lot. What can the small people of the world do to help themselves, to participate in this great story that we've been telling since day one of this course about creating a world in which we will all be the subjects and the objects of our own development? Now, there was a great fear, and you could say after 68 too, this becomes especially important in the 70s, that Western Europe had abandoned politics and been transformed into a society of happy slaves, which many French anti-Americans saw across the Atlantic. This was a kind of vision that of the effect of 68 as having made people give up, in some sense, on the promise of changing their own lives, making a better world. And we have increasingly radical, increasingly shrill, you could say, voices arguing for the need to rise up, to orchestrate revolution. One of the most famous examples of this is the RAF. Do you know what that stands for? Yeah, the Rote Armee Fraktion, or the Red Army faction, or the Baader-Meinhof group. A left-wing German terrorist organization, in some ways seen as one of the places where the idea of and the techniques of terrorism are born. Founded in 1970 to protest the genocide in Vietnam, the way in which, you could say, American politics is dominating the world, led by Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof. It's the subject of a film that actually got quite good reviews back in 2008. And we might just take a moment to look at the trailer here.
Germany, 1967. The children of the Nazi generation have grown up in the ruin their parents created. They vowed fascism would never rule their country again.
Diesmal werden wir Widerstand leisten. Wir haben eine Verantwortung vor der Geschichte. Wir bauen eine Gruppe auf. Wir werden die politischen Verhältnisse ändern.
Wir machen das. Wollen wir dabei draufgehen?
Die Männer schlafen hier in dem Gebäude, die Frauen da.
We are staying together. Screwing and shooting are the same.
People try to put us down.
brauchen eine Spezialeinheit, die darauf trainiert wird, in Zukunft solche Wahnsinnigen auszuknipsen.
Und wir machen die Grenzen dicht. Wir klopfen an einem einzigen Tag die gesamte Bundesrepublik durch.
In their fight for freedom, they lost themselves in the cause
Da sind mehr von uns drin als draußen.
and ignited a revolution around the world.
Das läuft total aus dem Ruder.
Meet the original faces of terror.
Ich werde mich niemals damit abfinden, dass man nichts tut. Niemals.
The Baader-Meinhof complex, based on the true story of the Red Army faction.
So that's a cinematic take on it. Lots of explosions, maybe too many actually. But you notice Mark Mausauer in his book Dark Continent maybe offers a slightly more sober but take on exactly that same problem, that same situation. The events of 1968 created a fragmented and bitterly dogmatic leftist fringe, tempted by violence and unable or unwilling to comprehend the scale of capitalism's triumph. It had its own way of life, with endless proclamations, critiques, and public theses, and a fondness of intellectual gurus whose pronouncements did not save their followers from a complete misreading of the political situation. This detachment from the realities of power reached its culminating expression in the terrorist Red Army faction in West Germany, which saw itself as a city guerrilla force carrying out an armed anti-imperial struggle under the slogan, "Victory in the People's War." In other words, the voices claiming most, you can say, loudly, and striving for freedom, for liberation, for the promises of modernity and development and democracy are in fact these kinds of voices here, voices that are in some sense very marginal, voices that are also advocating, once again, in a kind of 19th century sense, for violence as the only way to create freedom, and in the process, you could say, alienating most of the people who would otherwise have supported their cause. So the problem of of creating a movement that in fact represents something that is in the interests of the whole or the majority of people remains the central question of the late 20th century. The overall situation is well described also by the intellectuals of the day. Jürgen Habermas, when I last checked, he's still alive, the great German thinker, talked about, and a fellow traveler of the Frankfurt School, really spent a lot of his career devoted to this problem, about how a consumer, how we've created a new society based not on the active citizen, but the consumer. The consumer, a passive conformist object of commercial pressures, seemed to have replaced the active citizen imagined by social theorists during the 1940s. This Frankfurt School, the German social critics who went into exile in the United States during World War II, talked about mass society and false consciousness. And they drew a connection between what had happened in World War II and what was happening now. As these left-wing elites saw it, the same masses who before the war had abdicated their own judgment to follow Hitler were now flocking mindlessly in droves into the stores, just buying things. In other words, the kind of people who wants to go to a department store and to make themselves materially well off, that is the same mentality that had previously led to all the horrible things of the 20th century. And it came from an abdication of meaningful politics. So we have an interesting kind of problem here. We looked at the Red Army faction, all of this violence, this situation which seems to be an abandonment of ideology, and this linking of political fanaticism and violence on the one hand, and passivity and apathy on the other. The loss of an active citizenry and a depoliticized mass is what the crisis of modernity are all about. And why? A new language, a language that can unite people, a language like the kind that Bakhtin seemed to offer in some levels, was so much desired in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But I want to leave this section and move on to the last two sections of this lecture, posing this question. And this is a great question, I think, for the whole course, and especially for the 20th century. Where did all the evil of the 20th century come from? Where did all the violence, all the suffering, or the death, We have a partial explanation already in the Faustian myth, in the notion that we have to remove. There will always be an old couple. There will always be a Gretchen who stands in the way of progress and development. And some people will have to suffer and be sacrificed for the making of a new world order. But I think we can change, or at least we can pose this question in a slightly different way. We can ask, was the great problem of modernity that people cared too much or that they did not care at all? Is our faith to blame or a failure to have any faith at all? Is the problem with the sacred or with the profane, in other words? When we look at this predicament we face in the late 60s and early 70s of political fanaticism and violence on the one hand, people who seem to be so radically committed to their cause as the Red Army faction. At the same time, masses flocking to the department stores to buy things and not really caring about anything at all. We have to ask, where does the problem really lie? Did we believe too much or not enough? With that, I want to move to the two possible solutions to this crisis of modernity. One is the return to more traditional authorities, the return to anti-modern orthodoxy, a return to faith, you might say. So in a world where we've decided that modernity has created something bad or problematic, we have to ask where we should go. We can go back to the beginning. For in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this is, you could say, something we start to see in the 1970s. A return to traditional authorities, a return to religiosity, and to the principle and idea of faith. A great symbol of this, in the Western world at least, is the emergence of Pope John Paul II. Pope from 1978 to 2005, he reinvigorates or creates, you could say, a role for the Pope that's unprecedented in European history. The Pope was never so important or so powerful as he was when Pope John Paul II came to power. In many ways, you could say he symbolized also the best of the traditional world, but he fused it with the modern. A Polish national, at the same time a Catholic cosmopolitan, he was a figure who was vigorous and well-educated, attended the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, culturally conservative, profoundly anti-communist, supported Lech Wałęsa's Polish Solidarity movement, trade union movement in the 1980s. He spoke some 12 languages, including Esperanto. He visited 129 countries and healed, in many ways, relations with Judaism, Islam, and the Anglican Church. The one church he didn't really manage to actually influence that much was the Russian Orthodox Church. So that which kind of remained outside. It's an interesting way in which that cultural divide between Russia and Europe is, in this moment at least, very pronounced. So Pope John Paul, you could say, is in some ways a symbol of a reinvigorated Catholicism, but a reinvigorated faith in religion. But what I want to focus on here is particularly the way in which religion and the notion of a return to faith played a role in Soviet questioning of authority. And it does so in the most brilliant, and I think, way in the great Soviet film of 1984, Repentance. Moje niebo in Georgian, or Покаяние, right, in Russian. It was banned at the time of its release. It tells the story of a beloved mayor of a Georgian town, a town that looks a lot like Tbilisi. Say, a mayor by the name of Varlam. And we discover very early on that Varlam actually looks a lot like, or bears a striking resemblance. He's kind of a synthesis of Hitler and Stalin, as the mayor, the great authority figure. And at the beginning of the film, we discover the woman pictured here, after his death, digging up his corpse. She keeps on digging up his corpse and putting it around town and saying this past cannot be allowed to rest. The politics of memory we haven't confronted the politics of memory of our past. This man is so much more and so much more evil than we have given him credit for. And then she's put on trial. We see her at her trial here, where she's questioned. And we can learn about her mother, Nino, her father, Sandro, and she herself is Keti. And we learn about all the things that this mayor has done to her family. the way her family has personally been persecuted by the mayor. Along the way, we confront the mayor in these dream sequences. Here we see, this is the father, Sandro, and we see the mother. And I just want to play a couple, this clip for you, so you can see, get a sense of the kind of the magical realism of this film. This is a world in which you see knights on horseback in armor, and at the same time automobiles. It's a combination of the old and the new. We see how modernist dreams can turn into dystopian nightmares, as does in this dream sequence. That's the kind of aesthetic of the film. But the content that I want you to sort of think about here is how it addresses, say, the problem of modernity with this discourse on faith in science. And this scene we have, which I think is the key one for understanding kind of the message of the film and the way the film becomes maybe the best representative of this problem. We see a 6th century Georgian church and how it is being used in the film, it's claimed, for scientific experiments. And the claim is, and the problem is, the foundations will crumble if the experiments continue. We start with this radio broadcast where Einstein talks about the tragedy of the modern scientists, and then we have the larger question here of what is the value of a church, of religion, for a secular age that no longer believes in religious things. Let's play a little bit of this. We see sort of the evocation of this church, a lot of attention sort of to the kind of this holy space that has been ignored. You see, this is the science and faith together. The experiments are being conducted in the church. You have all of these devices there designed to measure vibrations, and then you have this hymn being sung at the same time. It's the question, you could say, of how should science and religion go? Should they? In throwing out religion, have we gotten rid of what makes us human?
სიკვდილის წინ აინშტაინმა უკანასკნელად აღემაღლა ხმა და ათეტიური სიტყვებით ამცნო ქვეყნიერებას.
This is important.
ტრაგედიის შესახებ. აი როგორი ანდერძი დაგვიტოვა მან. თანამედროვე მეცნიერის ბედი ტრაგიკულია. შთაგონება მასში ნათელ აზრებსა და შინაგან დამოუკიდებლობას ბადებს. მან კი თავისი ზეადამიანური ძალისხმევით საკუთარი პიროვნების სოციალური დამონების და მოსპობის კი არ გამოსჭედა. საქმე იქამდეც მივიდა, რომ პოლიტიკურმა მმართველობამ მას რკინის აღვერი ამოსდა. თუ წარსულს ჩაბარდა ის დრო, როცა მეცნიერის აზროვნების თავისუფლება და მისი კვლევა-ძიების დამოუკიდებლობა ანათებდა და ამდიდრებდა ადამიანთა ცხოვრებას. თუ მეცნიერული ჭეშმარიტების ბრმაძიებაში დაჰკარგა მან თავისი ღირსება და დაივიწყა ადამიანური ვალი კაცობრიობის წინაშე. ჩვენ სამყაროს ემუქრება კრიზისი, რომლის ძალა თითქოს არ ესმის სწორედ იმან, ვინც უნდა გადაწყვიტოს საყოველთაო სიკეთისა და ბოროტების უდიდესი ამოცანება. ატომის შეუბოჭავმა ძალამ ყველაფერი გარდაქმნა ჩვენი აზროვნების გარდა და ამის გამო მივექანებით ჯერ არ ნახული კატასტროფისაკენ. ჩვენი დროის ყველაზე გადაუდებელი ამოცანაა ავიცილოთ ეს საშიშროება. კაცობრიობას მხოლოდ ახლებური აზროვნება გადაარჩენს. გადამწყვეტ წუთს მოვიკრებ უკანასკნელ ძალას და მთელი ხმით მოგიწოდებთ ამისაკენ.
გადაცემა მსოფლიოს უდიდესი მოაზროვნენი ალბერტ აინშტაინი დამთავრებულია. მოისმინეთ მსუბუქი მუსიკის კონცერტი.
Fast forward to the great sort of confrontation between the committee that wants to save the church and the mayor who has sort of ordered really the experiments to be conducted there.
ჩვენი თხოვნა დაუყოვნებლივ შეწყდეს შემდგომი ლაბორატორიული ცდები ეკლესიაში როგორმე დაჩქარდეს სამეცნიერო კვლევითი დაწესებულებისათვის შესაფერისი შენობის აგება.
ესე იგი თქვენ პროგრესის და მეცნიერების წინააღმდეგი ბრინჯანდებით.
ჩვენ მხოლოდ იმ მეცნიერების წინააღმდეგი ვართ, რომელიც ტაძარს დაგვინგრევს.
ბატონო ვარ. მხოლოდ და მხოლოდ თქვენ, როგორც ქალაქის თავს, შეგიძლიათ გადაარჩინოთ ტაძარი. იმედია ჩვენს თხოვნას უყურადღებოდ არ დატოვებთ.
დოქსოპულო, რა განკარგულებაა ტაძრის თაობაზე?
საქმე ეხება ძველ ნახევრად დანგრეულ ეკლესიას.
ვინ მოგახსენათ, მაგრამ დანგრეულიაო.
თითქმის დანგრეული.
თითქმისო. შედავთ, თითქმისო.
შენობა თითქმის ინგრევა. გაჩნდა ანტისანიტარია. საძირკველში ჩაიბუდეს ქვეწარმავლებმა. დიახ. აღარავინ ეკარება თქვენს ეკლესიას. წავიდა ის დრო ხალხს რომ სიბნელეში ამყოფებდნენ და ჩაშიჩინებდნენ ადამიანი ღმერთმა შექმნაო და ასე შემდეგ. განზრახ უმალავდით. მაიმუნისაგან რო ვართ წარმოშობილი. ყველა მიზეზის გამო გადაწყდა ძველი შენობის დანგრევა და მის ადგილას იგივე მასალით.
მოიცა დოქსოპულო. მოიცა.
ბატონო დოქსოპულო. ღვთის მშობლის ტაძარი ერთ-ერთი უბრწყინვალესი ძეგლია ადრეული ქრისტიანობის. თუ თქვენ არ გესმით, რომ თითოეული ტაძრის დანგრევა ჩვენი სიღრმისეული ფესვების ამოკაფვას ნიშნავს. იმ ფესვებისა, რომლებიც გვასაზრდოებენ და სასიცოცხლო ძალებს გვაძლევენ. მას დასვით ჰომეროსი, რუსთაველი, დანტე, აღარ აშღერდება ბახი, ბეთჰოვენი, ვერდი, ავანგრიოთ პეტრეს ტაძარი, ნოტრ-დამი, სვეტი ცხოველი. ეს ხომ ერის თვითმკვლელობა. ბატონო ვარლან, ჩვენი ეკლესიის ერთ-ერთი რეგალია სამსჯვარი. ურსმანი, რომლითაც ჯვარდაცვას მაცხოვარი. ის სამშვალი სწორედ ამ ტაძარში ინახებოდა. სამშვალი უგზავნოდ დაიკარგა. ხლა ტაძარი გვანგრევა.
კი, მაგრამ ჩვენი
დოქსაბულო. მომაწოდე განკარგულება ლაბორატორიის შესახებ. აი ბატონებო, ჩემი განკარგულება. მაღალი ძაბვის დანადგარებისათვის ახალი შენობის აგება პრინციპში მიზანშეწონილად მიმაჩნია. მაგრამ თანხის უქონლობის გამო ჯერჯერობით თავი უნდა შევიკავოთ. ასე რომ ბატონო მოსე ჩვენს გვაწუხებს ეს საკითხი. თუმცა ეთყობა უნდა ვიჩქაროთ. თქვენ მე ამაში სავსებით დამარცხმულეთ. დოქსაბულო. შენ დედა ხარ. პავს. რა მოხუცია. დედა რომ ალბათ გაგიხდეს, არ მოულე. ასე ზეგლიც. 6 საუკუნის ზეგლი ჩვენი არის დიდება, ჩვენი არის ისტორია. ავადმყოფითადის მოვლა პატრონობაზე ხელისაგება ვერაფერი დედაშვილობაა, დოქსაბულო. კარგად აიხსოვნა. მოკლედ ჩვენ მადლობის მეტი რა გვეთქმის ამ პატიოსანი ადამიანებისათვის, რომ არ დაიზარეს და სიმართლისათქმელად მობრძანა. მე კი პატიოსან სიტყვას გაძლევთ, რომ ყველაფერს ვიღონებ ამ საქმის მოსაგვარად. რა შეეხება ბატონო მოსე ცდებს, რამდენადაც მე ვიცი, ცდები ტარდება მინიმალური, შეზღუდული სიმძლავრით. ასევე ჩატარდება ახალი შენობის აგებამდე.
დანადგარები მთელი სიმძლავრით რომ ამუშაონ, არა მარტო ტაძარს, მთელ ჩვენ ქალაქს აიტანს სასჯი.
დაბრძანეთ? თქვენ თვალწინვანად გურებთ მე ამ დოკუმენტს. შენ თავისუფალი ხარ. სხვა საქმე ხომ არაფერი გაქვთ? არაფერი. მაშინ ახლა შეიძლება გამოვიკვლიოთ ზოგიერთი ბიოგრაფიული წვრილმანი. ქალბატონი მარიამისა და ბატონი მოსეს სისფერ-სისხლიანი თავადიშვილების ბიოგრაფია ჩემთვის შეიძლება ითქვას სრულიად გასაგებია. რაც შეეხება პატრიციამ სანდროს, აქ ერთი საკითხი მოქვს გასარკვევი. ბატონო სანდრო, თუ გსმენიათ რაიმე ასეთ პიროვნებაზე, ტარასი ტარასკონელზე.
როგორ არ მსმენია? ტარასი ტარასკონელი ახლდათ ჩემი დიდპაპის მამა.
გამოდის რომ ჩვენ ერთი წინაპარი ვყოლია. მეც ტარასი ტარასკონელი შთამომავალი ვარ.
რას გვიძანით?
დიახ ბატონო.
საიდი?
ამაზეც ცალკე. ახლა ერთი ეს მიბრძანეთ. თუ ალღო და თვალი არ მღალატობს, მე მგონი თქვენ მოედანზე ცხოვრობ, ორსართულიან სახლში. პატარა გოგონა, აივნიდან საპნის ბუშტებს რომ უშვებდა ჩემი მერადარჩევის ცერემონიალზე. თუ არ ვწდები ისაა თქვენი ბინა.
დიახ.
ყველაფერს ხედავ, ყველაფერს ვამჩნევ. ასე რომ იფრთხილდით. ისე ხუმრობა გვერდით გადავდოთ და არცებითად ესაა ცხოვრება. ზოგი საპნის ბუშტებს უშვებს, ზოგი ხალხის მტრებს დაძდევს. თქვენ მხატვრების შემოქმედებითად იწვით. მათხოვრები მათხოვრობენ, მკვლელები კლავენ, ბოზები ბოზობენ. Это разве нормально? А это разве нормально?
So I think we have in this passage, it's a little slow, of course, as films of the past always were, but a kind of a wonderful exposition of this problem of modernity in the context of faith, and how, and the proposition or the proposal here, that somehow, perhaps, on the part of at least of the concerned citizens, that we're ignoring our monuments. And the role of Varlam, sort of the mayor, too, is interesting here. He agrees with them on some level. He compares the church to a mother. But the larger question is what to do with the traditions of the past, right? This is the Faustian question. How much should we preserve of the past as we move into the future? And here, too, you can see his anger, right, in the last moment. If we don't actually clear the streets of the unsanitary conditions, get rid of everything we'll have a situation that is not normal, as he says in it. We'll have a situation in which sluts will walk the streets, in which paupers will beg, in which all these horrors will happen. And this is maybe the price of not eliminating the church. Enemies of the people. We hear that phrase here once again. Throughout at the beginning of the film, we see the main character sort of digging up the body of the mayor, trying to tell the people of the town that they can't forget about his legacy, that they have only a one-sided view of him. The director, Tengiz Obaladze, who produced the film, had only joined the Communist Party a few years earlier in 1978, and very quickly, Repentance became a major event in the West. It was released around the Special Jury Prize at Cannes. And in 1988, the Georgian Soviet Foreign Minister, Edward Shevardnadze, got the film approved for release within the Soviet Union, and it became a symbol, in some sense, of Gorbachev's glasnost, or openness policy. And it has, I would argue, one of the best last lines of 20th century cinema. We see it in the last moment, and I want to sort of move on to the final section of the lecture simply by playing for you the very concluding bit of the film. In the end, we see how this violence that has been perpetuated by the mayor comes back to haunt the family. His grandson ends up committing suicide with a gun, and then the father, who has been on the mayor's side all along, decides that it's finally time to dig up the body himself. And we see him digging up the body and disposing of it, and as a way of reconciliation with the past. And then we see in the final bit the woman again, the child, as she kind of tries to come to terms with what has happened, and is addressed by an old woman in the street. Final scene is a circling back to the beginning. We didn't see it now, but the film begins with a newspaper article.
ხუთმეტი წლით იყო ჩემზე უფროს. 78-ის იქნებოდა ახლა. დიდი შინაარსიანი ცხოვრება გაიარა. დიდი. აი გას. დიდებული გასო.
რა ვიცი, ამბობენ ცოდვები მოსვენებას არ აძლევდაო.
რასა გქონდა? რასა გიქონებს ეს ხალხი? ასეთი კეთილია. ცოდველი ადამიანი. მეორე არ დადიოდა დედამისის. სულდების საში იყო ის რა ვარკო.
ეს გზა ღვთისმშობლის დაძართან მიმიყვანს. ეს გზა ღვთისმშობლის დაძართან არ მიმიყვანს.
ეს ვარნამის ქუჩა. ეს გზა დაძართან არ მიგიყვანს.
არა. მაშ რა საჭიროა იგი? რის მაგნისია გზა თუ კი დაძართან არ მიმიყვანს.
In some ways, I think this is the question. It's the question of religion, but it's the question of European modernity. What good is a road if it doesn't lead to a church? What's the point of all of our progress, all of our revolutions, all of our development, all of our democracy, if it doesn't take us to a place of greater belief and solidarity? And of course, they're literally asking about a church in a world that has transformed the church into a square devoted to the megalomania of the mayor. But this film, better than any other, reminds us of the turn back to religion in the last quarter of the final half of the of the 20th century as one solution to the crisis of modernity of 1968. And this question, I think, embodies at best: what good is a road if it doesn't lead to a church? All what we've done has taken us through science, through development, into technologies of destruction, of killing, of replicating genes perhaps, but we don't know why we're doing it. And we need some kind of higher purpose, some kind of higher moral compass. The other, say, solution to the crisis of modernity was post-modernity or post-modernism. From the death of God to the death of the author. And of course, God was declared dead already in 1882. And most of the European philosophers of the interwar, certainly the post-war period, accepted that death as the basis or the principle of their thinking. In 1944, Jean-Paul Sartre, or maybe it was the year before, published the great work of French existentialism, Being and Nothingness. Existentialism for Sartre was based on atheism, rejection of God, of the idea that our existence precedes our essence. We are what we do. We have to take complete and full responsibility for ourselves and our own actions. We are thrown into the world, but we make our own meaning. This idea of making your own meaning, which you can say is very central to the whole modernist project, becomes, you can say, intensified, or the idea that we somehow have to make do in a world where meanings are not given from above, with the next great, say, turn in European intellectual thought. In many ways, the replacement of Jean-Paul Sartre by Claude Lévi-Strauss as the great European intellectual, and certainly the great French intellectual, signifies also the emergence of language and linguistic philosophy and criticism as the basis for understanding everything about the world. And that kind of thinking, the linguistic thinking, radicalizes with a new generation, or a slightly, you could say, younger group of scholars, one of whom is Jean-François Lyotard, who publishes The Postmodern Condition in 1979. Now, The Postmodern Condition, you can say, is a work that calls all of modernity into question, the whole story I've been telling you throughout this course. So what's the point? What's the argument of The Postmodern Condition as a work? Really, that there are no more grand narratives. That the story I have been telling you is in some sense false or meaningless or pointless. The story of development over a long period of time, stories of socialism or capitalism, stories of the making of the new man. All of these tales of development, democracy, revolution somehow miss the point or fail to grasp the true nature of our lives or what we should care about in life. All that we have are petits récits, small narratives, little stories. It's a perfect philosophy, you could say, for the age of mass consumerism, for an age of people who are what they buy and kind of define themselves by their little choices and their little actions. It's perfect philosophy, you could say, for the age of identity politics. I am not merely defined by my race, nor by my class, nor by my interests. I'm all those things together and many things more. The world of postmodernism, you can say, is a world without big stories. It's a world with little tales that are self-contradictory, contradictory among themselves, that seem to appeal to a notion that human beings have no essence, have no crucial identity, have no sort of humanist values to fall back on. It's completely, you could say, the antithesis of this turn back to religion that you see also happening at the same time with the anti-modern reaction. Postmodernism is at the same time, or at once, you could say, a rejection of modernity and its intensification. It's a contradictory process that leads us both deeper into modernity while at the same time questioning the big story. And it happens really through a bunch of linguistic philosophy and thought that's been developing over the course of the 20th century, beginning with the great Swiss-French theorist of language, Ferdinand de Saussure, at the University of Geneva, who publishes his general course of linguistics the year after his death, really, or a few years after his death, which offers a new way of thinking about language that starts to become powerful, you could say, especially after the Second World War. Now, the question that Saussure sort of confronts is, how should we study language? How should we think about language? In the 19th century, language was studied, like almost everything, diachronically, that is, historically. In the 19th century, history, you could say, was the great field or discipline of the humanities. When you want to study something, you have to know its history. You have to know how it starts, where it begins, and where it develops. But Saussure's sort of revolution in language was to actually suggest a completely different way of thinking about language. Language not as philology, the study of development over time, but synchronically. He gives birth to modern linguistics by saying that we have to focus not on how language develops, but how language works. How language works within the sentence that you use. How meaning is made not over time, but in a single grammatical construction. It's hard sort of to overestimate or to overstate how important this revolution was. Turning our thinking from a historical perspective to a synchronic way of grasping a single moment. Now, the great opposition that he started with, that gave, you could say, birth to this way of thinking, was the distinction between the sign and the referent. He noticed that in language, we have signs and referents. We have things. I have a pen here. This is the referent. The sign is the way I refer to the pen. It's my word pen. It's what I write down about the pen. It's any kind of gesture, symbolic gesture that allows me to speak about this thing that exists here. Now, this becomes a little bit more complicated when we notice that the sign is itself divided. We have signs and reference, but within the signs, we have a signifier, the mark, and the signified, or the concept. We can all be thinking about a pen right now, but that's the signified, it's the concept that we're thinking about. But the signifier is the word I'm saying. Neither is actually the pen. The concept of the pen and the word for the pen, and that when we think about how thought works in general, how any idea occurs to human beings, we have to take this into account. This changes pretty much every discipline: anthropology, sociology, psychology, even the sciences to some extent. Along the way, he comes up with a major distinction that starts to inform all of thought moving into the second half of the 20th century. And that is the distinction between langue, or language, grammar, the rules according to which we speak, structures in other words, and parole, or sort of speech, what we actually say, the texts or discourses we produce. Think about this. He's saying that when we think about language, forget about the historical origins of words and how they come about. Talk about how they work within a sentence. And when I use my language to talk to you in a sentence, I'm actually doing two things at once. I'm putting together a discourse, a text, the words that are coming out of my mouth. But how do I know which word should come out of my mouth? It's because I have a grammar. I have a structure in my head according to which I'm arranging those words, according to which those words acquire meaning. The making of all meaning for all creatures in any time or place has to do with this relationship. The things you actually say and the structures according to which they are expressed. Now, this is what ignites, you could say, first of all, the structuralist sort of thinkers of the 1950s and 60s. Roland Bart is the one writer I chose for you from this because he kind of spans the divide. He was known as an early structuralist and then as a kind of a post-structuralist as well. And an important figure precisely for doing what so many others do, but more explicitly applying the linguistic theories of Ferdinand de Saussure. Roland Bart was an interesting figure, 3 times, you could say, marginal, in the sense that he was from the provinces, he wasn't from Paris. He was always in poor health, he had tuberculosis, and he was also homosexual. And so in some ways, he was always on the peripheries of societies. He was not admitted to the Grandes Écoles in France. He was not a member, you could say, he wasn't at the École Normale Supérieure. I mean, the great institutions of the highest, that Sartre, for example, had attended, or the greatest French intellectuals had attended. And he, as a marginal figure, you could say, in the French academic establishment, he was especially sensitive to this relationship between signifiers and signifieds, and the way in which the dominant power of the world was sort of constructed by people that did not necessarily have the interests of the majority at heart. His Mythologies, published in 1957, of course, was a collected work of essays that had appeared in the French press. In Figaro, or rather, he was analyzing a lot of French periodicals like Paris Match and Figaro, and trying to show, in some sense, you might remember how we started talking about Bakhtin in this lecture, but how power, how the authoritative discourse sort of the world is not really something that is imposed from above. It's not what the president says, but it's the way that people in their everyday lives hear what the president is saying. It's the way in which meaning is constructed on the lowest level. How magazines for popular consumption create attitudes and thoughts and ideas that people then commit their whole lives to. Power is not something that can be decreed or ordered. It doesn't come out of the barrel of a gun. It comes out of language. It comes out of the manipulation and the use of language. And you could say he added a second layer to Saussure's linguistic analysis, which has come to be known as, in some sense, semiotics. And semiotics is developed in many different places, but this is the kind of the scheme he gives us in his book. You see, language is based on a sign which is divided into a signifier and a signified. And a myth, he says then, is just like a second order of that kind of division. It's a sign, signifier, and signified that it arises out of the linguistic sign. All this might seem somewhat complicated, but the important thing for our purposes to take away from all of this is that power is constructed by and within language. And that language, when we analyze it, the hope, of course, is that we can perhaps liberate ourselves from those structures of power. We can see how we're being manipulated. We can come to terms with the way in which language is, we can come to terms with the way in which language has created the points of view that we hold. Ultimately, we can come to see how the dominant ideology exploits popular culture by using its motifs and turning them into second-order signs or myths. So I only gave you 3 mythologies of his myths to read about, but there's so many more, and some of them are quite funny and interesting. Red wine. How did red wine become a symbol kind of French culture and democracy? The use of, say, wrestling on television. These are all these popular cultural phenomena he analyzed to show how the meanings in these are constructed by language. Along the way, he shows how we should have to read and decipher myth, and that myth is a stolen language, and that myth is ultimately depoliticized speech. Myth is something, depoliticized speech means that we take things that actually have very profound political meanings, and we deprive them of those political connotations or implications. Politics, for the left, remains a good thing, and a powerful thing, an important thing. Politics is the way in which we change the world. To be depolitical is to say we can't change the world, or we have to accept what exists. If you take a look here, I'm going to go for a few minutes more. But what are myths, and how do they work? This is a great example of how power, you could say, is constructed in popular culture. The Paris Match cover of the young sort of African boy giving the French salute. What is the signifier and what is the signified here? And what is the myth? What's being concealed and what's being shown? How is power being constructed just by this picture? This picture speaks 1,000 words. So what are those 1,000 words? Okay, so this is constructing a vision of France as a good place, making us see the empire, the French Empire, as a positive thing. A signifier here is a black boy giving a French salute. Right? That's this on the level of the sign. What's signified is the idea of Frenchness and militariness. Somehow, we've given a sense of hope, we've given a sense of civilization, a sense of purpose to the African continent. The African continent has been civilized by the French, is the story that's happening in the background here. How can you be against the French Empire and the French colonization of Africa when it actually gives hope to little boys living in Africa? These are all the stories that are lurking within this image and that we assimilate on an almost subconscious level. We don't even think about it very much. But if you're confronted with these kinds of images every second of your day, this is what constructs the meanings of your lives. The way you come to see France as something good or bad. The way you come to see, if this picture were instead a little boy being abused by a French soldier, you'd have a very different notion of what the France was doing there. So this interpretation these myths are visual as well as linguistic. Pay attention to how what we see sort of here an evocation of a discussion of the French bourgeoisie as a class and the French nation sort of as those groups whose interests are being served by these myths in the media. And when you look at the particular myths, we won't look at these at all, but just the Batory Cruise, which is all about French people going to visit the Soviet Union. The man on the street on strike is how strikes are being viewed and represented in the French media. Or African grammar, the kind of language that is being used to talk about battles and the engagement in Africa. With words, he defines all these words. What do destiny, dishonor, and laceration mean? I just provide one little example here at the end. Laceration, or a wound, that's what a laceration is. This term helps accredit the notion of history's irresponsibility. So that sentence is saying, by using the word laceration, the French press is showing us how there's no responsibility, that the French government has no responsibility for all of the death and destruction that happens there. They use a kind of language to say it's an inevitable consequence of it's a historical inevitability. Of course, all countries, all governments are always using language in particular ways, but there are ways of using language that make you love something or hate something. And Bart was one of the earliest people to point out how important these little choices in language are to what you think, what you want, what you value, whether you're willing to rise up against a power or whether you're willing to accept its authority over you. So dealing with this, you could say, is ultimately essential to understanding or to dealing with the question of power. Now, the ultimate power, the ultimate authority is the author himself. And in The Death of the Author, Roland Bart takes on, you could say, the ultimate source of authority by asking us to think about authority as something that lies not ultimately in the intentions of the author, the last line here, but in the understandings of the reader. There's only one author for any text, but there are many readers. And if we focus not on what the author is trying to tell us, because what the author is trying to tell us is confused to begin with, we can realize that the interests of society are better served by looking at or focusing on interpretation. This is the beginning of reception theory, the notion that what meaning in the world lies not in what is intended, but what is understood, the way we receive it. What I'm telling you, what I want to tell you, is less important than what you are all hearing. Each of you is hearing my lecture in a different way, but how you're hearing it is much more important than what I'm trying to tell you. Bart is shifting this emphasis in authority, saying the authority lies in how you understand me, not what I want to tell you. And we've made a mistake by focusing too much on the intentions of the author, on the intentions of authority. This is the beginning of postmodern relativism. How you hear me is more important than what I want to say. You could say this is one way in which the problems of democracy are kind of resolved by postmodernism and the postmodern turn away from the modernist promise of big narratives and big stories. I want to just conclude with Julia Kristeva's Crisis of the European Subject. Because in many ways, Julia Kristeva brings together Bart, Bakhtin. She was herself born in Bulgaria, attended a school of Dominican nuns, went to the university in Sofia, moved to Paris in 1965, and became the most important author at the prominent French journal Tel Quel. And she played, you can say, a facilitator role in introducing Roland Bart to the writings of Bakhtin. Right? I had this notion of Bakhtin's up before. Truth is not born, nor is it to be found inside the head of an individual person. It is born between people, collectively searching for truth in the process of a dialogic interaction. Julia Kristeva came up with this idea of intertextuality, you could say, which is a good example of how Russia and Europe are talking to one another now through Kristeva. Shaping a text's meanings by another text, intertextual figures are allusion, quotation, plagiarism, translation, pastiche, and parody. We see in the concerns of Bakhtin and Bart, facilitated through Kristeva, this hope, you could say, or vision, that meaning might lie in the space between us. Not only in how you read or understand me, not only in my intentions, but in that intermediate space. Remember Bakhtin's claim from the very beginning, the word is a two-sided act. The word is not only what, he's not saying, the word is not only what you understand, it's not only what I intend, it's between us. Now, this is the last slide here. We see here Julia Kristeva meeting Pope Benedict in 2011. It's an interesting moment, right? The meetings of postmodernism in the church, in some sense. The meetings of the two answers to the to the modernist predicament. And she talks about, in her speech at this time, the promise of a new European humanism. In some ways, we can see the predicament of everything we've talked about here. The self confronting the other is the problem of European history. Russia and Europe, who is self, who is other. And in Bakhtin's notion of dialogism, in Kristeva's idea of intertextuality, we have this hope that truth is not in you and not in me, but somewhere in the space between us, in language itself. And if the post-68 world is especially obsessed with language, and I think is for precisely this reason. Kristeva wrote in 1991 the book Strangers to Ourselves to remind us of the extent to which we don't even know who precisely we are, that our identities are in flux, that we're constantly looking for ourselves in others. But I don't think there's any better place to see the power and importance of language. The only caveat here that I want to leave you with is, but what if the space between us, which should be the basis of our common understanding, is filled with lies and deception? What if that itself is corrupt? And in many ways, the 2018 Sabina scandal made people think about this. The Sabina scandal was the revelation that Julia Kristeva herself had been a Bulgarian state security agent during all the time that she was in France. There was a 400-page dossier in the Bulgarian State Archive documenting her kind of collaboration with the secret police. She denied every involvement with this. The first time I gave this lecture was the day after this had been revealed. But I think it's good to end or conclude this lecture on a note of circumspection and uncertainty. It's very nice to talk about the possibility of language as an intermediate realm in which we can resolve all of our conflicts, in which we can achieve or realize true democracy, true development, true modernity, true revolution. But in order for that to work, we have to trust each other. And the history of the 20th century has been a history which has destroyed that trust. The history of World War II and its aftermath, and has created an environment in which even the people appealing to this idea of trust are under the greatest suspicion. So on that note, I'll leave you. Thank you.